it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Ryan Carvalho. He's the head of Nestlé Research, and he's also trained as an MBA. So he has published over 30 academic publications and gave over 40 invited national and international presentations on early childhood nutrition and pediatric health. In his tenure, he has also developed digital healthcare engagement strategies and launched innovative products and nutritional solutions in over 100 countries. So he will share with us more information on how we can connect the agricultural systems to nutrient-dense products. Ryan, over to you.
So good evening, everyone, and thank you for your time today. Thanks to the organizers for the opportunity to present. And what I want to talk to you about is looking at food systems all the way from starting with agricultural food systems to find out consumer consumption ecosystems and everything in between. So to start with, we know over the last decades, there have been a lot of food-based dietary guidelines that have been published. And while all of them are different in different countries with slight differences, essentially they talk about the importance of food groups to contribute to either closing nutrient gaps and enhancing human health. But what they also have more recently realized is bringing the importance of food cultures into food-based dietary guidelines. And what I'm showing you here is some of the more newer food-based dietary guidelines which actually bring in the cultural aspect to actually drive home the implementation of food-based dietary guidelines. If you look at the data on how food-based dietary guidelines are followed, overall, the data is quite surprising. When you look at developed countries, it can range anywhere from about 14% in Greenland to about 43% in the US following food-based dietary guidelines. And when you look at developing countries in some of the lower middle-income countries, those numbers are even lower, showing that about 40% follow one of these principles of food-based dietary guidelines. But when you look at them, and you look at the evolution of food-based dietary guidelines, what is very good is that we are seeing more and more sustainable food-based dietary guidelines being published. This is an example from Ethiopia, which was published in 2022. Because historically, we've talked about sustainability in very developed ecosystems around the world. But we really want to solve a lot of the problems associated with the data that Eileen showed and the contribution of food in some ways to the GHG or the global environmental impact. Considering sustainable food systems is as important as sustainable food-based dietary guidelines. I'm going to focus today on two aspects, because while it's great to talk about plant-based and planet-based or plant-rich dietary guidelines, we know that there is this transition of where we are today and where we need to get to. So I'm going to start with focusing on dairy and what we can do within food systems in dairy to actually make it more sustainable, make it more nutrient dense, and have a bigger impact to human health. And as we take a look at these food systems approach, I'm going to focus on three pillars of the food systems approach. I'm going to focus on agriculture, I'm going to focus on nutrition, and I'm going to focus on health. So starting with agriculture, it's very easy to think about, why don't we do one thing and apply it all over? But much like human diets and human health, agricultural systems, particularly when it comes to dairy and plants, is very diverse. This is an example of some of the diversity in the dairy agricultural food systems. You have pasture-based, which is typically about 50 to 500 cows who typically graze on grass and are fed a little bit of concentrates, and they have a significant GHG footprint from their milk. You have the tropical pasture-based, which is much smaller number of cows. These are anywhere from 20 to 60 cows, which are also grazing on farms. And then you have the confined dairy farms, which you see a lot about in different parts of the world, particularly in US and Europe, China being another big region, where you have anywhere from 100 to 10,000 cows, and they are fed primarily on silage or concentrates. and tend to have a lower GHG footprint because of the economy of scale that it drives. And finally, in a lot of parts of the world, you have smallholder dairy farmers who have anywhere from 1 to 20 cows. And this is very common and an important part of the food system when you consider countries like India, Pakistan, and Indonesia. So when you think about solutions and how can you make dairy more sustainable, it's not one size fits all. And to give you a sense of the impact of GHG in the dairy farming industry, most of it comes from enteric fermentation. And as a gastroenterologist, it makes me very happy now to find that in this world, when people see cows, they think gas. But it's not only enteric fermentation, but it's also the feed production that the animals need to eat, the grazing, the manure management, and finally the energy and transport. And the solutions typically are focused in 3 big buckets. There are what you can feed the cow to hopefully inhibit the bugs that produce methane and hopefully lower the methane production, or are called methanogen inhibitors. The second is soil carbon sequestration, retaining the carbon in the soil such that it doesn't get into the environment. And finally, manure management can be done in different ways, from using manure for household building material to manure for even biofuel production. But when you think about this, it's important to think of one group of people, and that's farmers. Because it's easy for us to think about why not just do this and reduce the carbon footprint of dairy? Well, when you're dealing with a smallholder farmer who has 1 to 20 cows in India or Indonesia, it's very hard for them to implement this, and this is where food systems are critical. So while we've talked about agriculture, let's talk a little bit about nutrition when it comes to dairy. We know the nutritional profile of milk, and it's rich in things like calcium, iodine, potassium, phosphorus, zinc, and it's also rich in certain vitamins. And it has an important role to play across ages and life stages in impacting the health of humans. What's interesting about milk is when you look at the data on these individual nutrients and their contribution to health versus the holistic food of milk, the impact of milk is a lot bigger, saying that the sum of the parts could have an exponential beneficial effect. So when you look at children, it's from healthy bones and teeth and supporting growth and development, both from the protein as well as from the calcium, and in some cases where it's fortified with vitamin D. In adults, to achieve the recommended protein intakes, but also to help with musculoskeletal health as we age, and similarly in seniors. And this brings up an important question when it comes to dairy and public health. What are the nutrient deficiencies that dairy can be used as, given its holistic matrix capabilities, to close nutrient deficiencies? And I'll show you some data on how dairy can influence health beyond just the nutrient composition of dairy. But starting with nutrients, we know that iron tends to be a dietary gap in a large part of the world, more so in lower middle income countries, but even exists in developed and high income countries. Using particular kinds of iron really helps in addressing some of the bioavailability that you can have when you have iron in matrices with a lot of anti-nutritional factors that may preclude some of that iron from being absorbed. What I'm showing you here is the kind of iron, certain kind of elemental iron forms really help with improving the amount of iron that you actually absorb. When you look at the percentage of nutrient inadequacy, so over here, the lower the number, the better, because this is the percentage of inadequacy. When you take milk versus milk, which has a significant iron fortification to it, you can significantly reduce the amount of inadequacy associated with not consuming enough iron. Taking this a little bit further and adjusting a little bit, not to personalization, but customization, so not in the direction that Eileen was talking about, but something that's more at a public health level, you can look at the nutrient deficiencies in different parts of the world. And what you see here is, as we all expect, when we look around this room, we all don't look the same. Neither does the nutrient deficiency profile in different parts of the world. But what milk also gives you the ability is to understand what is the right fortification that you can do to actually use milk as a great matrix to close some of those nutrient inadequacy gaps. This is dietary modeling data which shows that the percentage of inadequacy by adding a glass of micronutrient-fortified milk to children's diet in the Philippines significantly reduced the percentage of inadequacy across multiple micronutrients. And this is a great way where we can think about how you can impact nutrient inadequacy while addressing a lower GHG footprint, either through supplements, manure management, or even soil carbon sequestration. And finally, let's look at some of the data on how this can impact health. You heard Vincenzo talk about the opportunity to actually help food enhance health. This is one of the ways you can do that. We know that milk contains lactose, and through simple fermentation of specific enzymes, you can convert some of that lactose into things called prebiotics, like a galacto-oligosaccharide. And in a study that was done, where they used healthy subjects, and they gave them, through a washout period for the product, as well as 14 days without, they were able to show the prebiotic effect of galacto-oligosaccharides, which was transformed from lactose, really showing that milk as a matrix with the right agricultural system can lower its carbon footprint, with the right nutrient fortification can close nutrient inadequacies, and with the right enhancements can further improve the health that you get from milk consumption. So in summary, just from the milk part, before I talk about plant-based, or plant-rich, Eileen, I should say now, when you think across food systems, you are able to achieve three things. You're able to use foods that are universally available, like milk, and by working across the food system, starting with agriculture, you can help lower that footprint of that milk and leverage responsible sourcing such that milk, which is easily accessible to large parts of the world, can actually be more sustainable. You can use ideal micronutrient fortification to help milk close nutrient gaps. And finally, through enzymatic modification and consistency of prebiotics, you can help close certain health gaps across ages and life stages. But we do know that the consumer, and we do know that for the health of the planet, we do need to move from a very animal-predominant diet to a more plant-rich diet. But as I showed you the agricultural systems on dairy being complex and diverse, it's the same when it comes to agricultural systems for plants. So when you think about plants, you have to understand that there are different species and different varieties and different cultivars, and these vary year over year based on environmental conditions, because as climate changes, we know that the environmental conditions change and the growing conditions change, and so everything from the yield to the nutrient quality can be impacted. And then across the world, much like I showed you with dairy farmers having different dairy agricultural systems, it exists for agriculture as well. Some crops are perennial, some crops are annual and change every year. So annual crops tend to be even further impacted based on annual climate changes. What also needs to be thought about is when you look at plant-rich or plant-based foods, are some of the questions that were asked earlier. You have to think about food safety. You have to think about toxins and mycotoxins, how are they produced, and what impacts them when you use certain regenerative agricultural practices. You have to think about heavy metals, which exist in soils in different parts of the world. And you have to think of microbes and pesticides to make sure that you minimize the risk that's associated with a lot of these risk factors to ensure safe food. We have to think about nutrition, whether it's protein quality, whether it's anti-nutritional factors or allergens, because as most of you know, across the world, we've moved from 6 to 7 to 8 and even more allergens, with sesame globally being one of the recently introduced allergens across the world. We have to talk about functionality, because good food only becomes good nutrition if you eat it, or else good food just remains as an Instagrammable post. We have to think about sustainability. Somebody asked about cost, and that's very critical. And it's not just cost for the consumer, but it's also cost to the farmer when he has to implement newer agricultural practices. And finally, Eileen said it very well, where the consumer acceptance of these different kinds of foods have to be considered as well. So let's look at a little bit more into taking a deeper dive in exploring how these diverse plant sources can drive diversity in the diet. Today, a lot of these plant-based milks, plant-based dairy alternatives, or plant-rich beverages are really focused on soy, wheat, or almond. But we know that these crops don't grow all across the world, and if we want to move to more sustainable diets, we have to leverage local food productions. You heard from Vincenzo about crops like groundnut or maize. And we've got to move from thinking about just these three to things like oat, fava, nut, coconut. And then if you look at continents in different parts of the world, things like spelt, cashew, linen, as we move forward to use local crops to actually produce more sustainable plant-based diets. And while this sounds simple, you have to ask the question, so why aren't we doing this today? Well, it's complex because today, just looking at soy versus a fava bean, you can see that the quantity of soy that's produced versus the quantity of fava bean that's produced is significantly different. And this high-yield soy versus a much lower-yield fava makes it much more lucrative for farmers to actually just grow one crop as against growing other diverse crops. Most of these crops today are used for animal feed. But when you look at the selection criteria, the kind of food or the kind of crop that you need for humans could sometimes be different than the kind of nutritional quality crop that you use when you use for animal feed. So the supply chain is really critical because today there's not enough of these second and third generation plant-based crops to actually implement in a plant-rich diet. When you look at the environmental impact and the nutrition, these digestibility and the protein quality is key. And finally, considering the food system, we have to think about the farmers, much like we do with the consumers, because they are the ones who have to be able to live within their communities and make a living wage when they implement newer crop varieties. Much like we talked about with dairy, let's talk about the nutrition of some of these plant-based proteins. We know that animal sources tend to have a higher protein quality. When we just talk about protein, there are other externalities as well. When we look at plants, we know that the protein quality is not the same as what you see from lean animal proteins, but varies depending on the kind of plant you consider, and it could even vary year to year, thinking about the cultivar, bringing in that complexity that last year's crop may not be the same in nutritional quality as this year's crop. But what we've done through a lot of research is actually say, what are the different plant sources that you can combine together to deliver on that protein quality? Because we know that that's key when you think about moving from a dairy-based diet to a plant-rich diet. And the good news is that you can optimize this by combining the right plant sources, but without forgetting important things about food safety, texture, as well as the agricultural systems. This allows consumers to get the protein quality they need with the desired diversity of plants that we know a lot of consumers would like to see in their diet. But while this addresses the question of quality, what about nutrient adequacy? We know that plants are not like dairy, and so a lot of these plant-based foods or plant-rich beverages need to be fortified. Here's an example of a publication that talked about some of these micronutrient fortification recommendations that can be considered when you're thinking about plant-based foods as part of a plant-rich diet. This micronutrient fortification is recommended because we don't want people to have inadequate protein or inadequate micronutrients in their diet. So it's a very important thing to consider because we know that while this works for a lot of situations. In certain situations, in particular ages and life stages, it's important to further customize the nutrient adequacy of these plant-based or plant-rich dairy alternatives or food alternatives if you want to meet both the nutrition quality and the nutrient adequacy. So to summarize, when we talk about plants, taking a food systems approach, like we do with dairy, is the right principle to follow. When we think about agriculture, it's about leveraging the regional and broad diversity of plant sources that exist in different parts of the world, while making sure that we always think about the yield for the benefit of the farmers. When we think about nutrition, it's important to think about protein quality, because we know that this is very important to consider in addition to making sure you exclude anti-nutritional factors and consider fortification. And finally, as it comes to health, we've got to respect the different needs across different populations and life stages, particularly when we think about early childhood, pregnancy, and the growing desire for some of these improved health outcomes when it comes to people living longer and healthier lives. With that, I want to thank you all for attending this presentation today. A special thanks to the organizers, as well as to FENS. And finally, thanks to all of you for your attendance today. Thank you.